Alright folks, let's do another example of a GUI based program in Python. We did an initial one with a couple of basic widgets last week. So let's develop another one that uses several more types of widgets and focus on some issues related to layout that we didn't address in the past. So I'm going to start by saving a program file I'll call GUI2 and start by adding an import statement. I'm going to do it this way from tkinter import star. Now in the past, let me throw up here for comparison. For instance, we could just do this. Import tkinter, kind of the standard import statement, and then what you have to do is anything you're referring to from within that package or module, you have to preface with the name. So it was tkinter dot whatever. When you do it this way, you don't have to preface each piece with the module name, with the package name. Another thing you can do is import tkinter, for instance, as tk, giving it kind of an alias, an alternative name to refer to it by, but doing it that way, again, you would still refer to any piece that you're referring to as tk dot, whatever the piece is. So doing it with the from version of the import lets us avoid having to do that altogether, and we'll see how that affects things coming up. All right, we're going to start with creating our root element as we have in the past. That is creating the app itself, the primary window. I can set the title of the window bar as we have seen in the past. I'll just call this one another GUI. And we can do things like call the configuration, the configure method to set various characteristics. I'll set the background in the case of this example to light blue. And I'll also do something else we didn't do last time. I'm going to set the min size of this window to be 600 by 350. So without doing anything else, I could run this, pull it into our viewing area here, and as before, it creates the window. I can resize it, but note I can only expand it if I get down to that minimal size of 600 by 350. It won't let me take it any smaller. And that just gives us a kind of a foundational size to work with. Okay. So we need to put some things into our window. I'm going to start with a label like I did last time. Again, in the past, I would have to preface the label name with tkinter dot, but because of the import the way we did it, I don't have to, and that's going to save us a lot of size and space over the course of this whole program. Now, if you remember, we put the container, the widget in which this label is going to reside as the first parameter, and that's true about any of the widgets we create. And again, we call the primary window root because it serves as the root element, the kind of foundational outermost element of our application. And in this example, as compared to the one we did last time, there'll be more kind of interesting sub-levels under that root level this time around. We're going to set the text of the label. I'm just going to put, I think, therefore I am, as a starting place. And I'm going to give it an initial font. Remember that a font is specified as a tuple containing the what's called the font family, the name of the font, if you will. In this case, Arial, the size of the font. And then you can put a third parameter here that is a third element to the tuple that is a string that specifies various other characteristics like bold or italic or whatnot. But I won't do that initially for this particular label. So there sets up the initial label itself, which I've called quote. And then I'm going to call the pack function, the pack method on the label, which is what determines the geometry manager, if you remember that discussion, and makes it visible within the root window. So I'll just do it that way for now. Let's run it again. And there it is. There's the label with the text, I think, therefore I am. It's packed into the window, which puts each widget on its own row and by default centers it on that row. So again, I can enlarge this and it keeps the label centered. Okay. One thing I can do when specifying the pack geometry is specify padding. I can do internal padding and external padding. I'm going to do, and you can do it along the x-axis or the y-axis. So I'm going to specify some padding along the y-axis around this label, and you can do it with one value, which will put the same amount of padding on either side, or you can do it as a tuple of two values. That's what I'm going to do here initially. I'm going to say put 50 pixels of padding above the label, again along the y-axis, and 20 pixels of space below. So let's run that again now with the new padding, and that positions it in a slightly different place. And as we see when we add things below this now, there's going to be 20 pixels of padding beneath it, and here's your 50 pixels of padding above. Okay, just to space things out a little bit. All right. So let's do something with this label. We're going to add a handful of widgets, interactive elements of my GUI to affect what this label looks like. So I'm going to start by creating a slider, or what in TK-Inter is called a scale widget. And I'm going to call it the size slider. Capital S scale is the name of the widget, the type of the widget. It's going to go straight into the root window. I'm going to specify a few other things when I create it. I'm going to specify its orientation. Orient equals horizontal. By default, it comes up as a vertical slider. And I'm going to want this one to be horizontal. And then you can specify a slider is your classic grab the thumbnail and drag it back and forth along the slider to specify a particular value along a scale, along some range of values. So I'm going to specify the from value and from to a certain thing, and the to value. So what's the minimum value and what's the maximum value? Now, because from, as we saw actually up here, is a keyword of the language, I'm not going to use it. I can't use it as a value there. So what they do is they added a underscore after that. So the name of the parameter for the scale constructor is actually from underscore and then 2. So what is the range of values that I'm going to allow the slider to have? I'm going to go from 12 to 54. And what this is going to specify is the point size of the label. The point size by default of the label, or initially when we created it, was 24. And I'm going to allow us to change the size of that dynamically by sliding this slider back and forth. And the minimum point size I'm going to allow is 12, and the maximum is 54. Let's see. Let's do a couple other things. I need to kind of map the value that's represented by this slider to a variable. That's how most tk-enter widgets work. You set up a special tk-enter variable. I'll call this one simply size, and it's going to be an int var. That's a special variable type that's again part of tk-enter, and it allows you to form this binding between the widget that controls the value and the variable you can use to refer to the value. So when I create then the scale, I need to specify the variable or var that's going to hold on to that value. All right. Let's see. I need to pack this one in so that I can see it. And I'll give it a padding along the Y of 15. We'll see how that comes into play as we move forward. All right, let's see what we have here. All right, so there's my label as I had before, the padding above and below. Here's my new scale or slider widget. It starts out at the minimal value here. I can slide it along and note that it goes no further than my from and to as specified. The minimum is 12, the maximum is 54, and there you go. Now note that also nothing happens when I do the slider. Nothing is changing about this. The goal is to change the font size of the label, but I didn't set up that relationship yet. So I have a perfectly good slider here that I can slide back and forth, but it doesn't actually do anything yet. Let's do a couple of things. This is awfully short, so I'm going to specify the length of the slider just to give it a little more kind of room to work here. And then I need to set up that event handler. We saw those last time. So up here, I'm going to go down to the next line and add a length value of 200 just to kind of make it a little longer. And then, as we've done before, I'm going to specify a command, basically the name of a function, that I'm going to call whenever this slider gets updated. And I'm going to call the function size update. Okay. So now we have to have a size update function. I'm going to put all of our functions up here at the top just under the import statement. We're going to have a few of these before we're all done. So let's put that one in. I'm going to define a function called size update, and a function, an event handler for a slider takes the value of that's on the slider. So I'm going to as an argument. So I'm going to specify an argument. I'm going to call it the new size, and that's automatically passed by the slider, by the scale widget, into this event handler. So what do I want to do? This is going to be called every time the slider changes value. So I want to update the size of the label, which is called quote. So I'm going to say quote dot configure and update. Really, it's only I don't have to update the string of the text. I only really need to update the font so I can change this, the size of the font itself. So I'm going to configure it, changing the font to, I'll keep it as Arial for now. And then instead of hard coding a value here, I'm going to put in new size, the size of the size that's specified by the slider. All right, I think I got everything set at the moment. So let's run this again. Nope, something's not right. Syntax error when I added the length here because I forgot to put a comma after the var. Now let's run it. This time it ran. So there's my slider. It has now a new length to it, a little bit longer, makes it a little more appealing, a little bit more kind of appropriate. And note that as I slide it now, it changes the size of the font. It's exactly what we wanted. I'm going to run this again to point out one other thing. So note that the slider comes up initially at the minimum point. That's what it does by default. But this initial label is of size 24 because that's what we said when we created it. So the moment I start moving this slider, it immediately kind of bounces it down to the level it's at. And then after that, at that point, it's working kind of normally. But let's make the two square up at the very beginning. So what I can do is set the initial value of the slider like so. After I create the slider, I'll say size slider dot set, and let's go ahead and give it the same value as the initial value. Clear the assistant here. So that's what he looks like initially, Arial 24. So let's have the size slider come up at 24. It actually sets the position of the slider to be at that point. And then that way, those two will be in sync. Let's run it again, make sure that's cooperating. And so it comes up already at 24, which is the size here. So there's no big jolt when I start to modify it. All right. We're going to change, before we're done, we're going to change the look and feel of some of these things so they blend in more. Right now we're using default backgrounds and whatnot. And I'm going to just leave those there or even deliberately set them to various colors just so it's really clear which pieces are what as we go to make things clear in terms of the layout, and then we'll come back and change some of those details so that it's a nice, clean, coherent piece. All right. Next, let's add another widget below this one. It's called an option menu button. That we're going to use to actually change the font family. I'm using Arial right now, but I want to let us have some variety there, some options to choose. So I'll come down here to the bottom after we've put in our slider, and let's put in something else. First of all, let's create a list of, again, this is called the font family, the name of the font, basically. And I'm going to create a list of them that we can make use of. We'll do Arial as our first one, but then I'll throw in Courier And how about Times New Roman? And I can have as many of these as I choose. I'll just kind of use those three for now. Let me clear out the shell here, give us a little more room. So there I have a list of font family names. I'm going to create another variable, another special tkinter variable that I'll just call family. And this one will be a string var. It will hold a string. And I'm going to set its initial value to be Arial, or I'm going to even specify it using the list. I will set it to the family list sub-0 as the default place. And that's just the variable. So now let's create the widget itself. I'm going to call it family button. And it's using the option menu widget. Again, I'm going to put this one directly in the root. The second parameter is the variable that's going to correspond. So as the option, as we choose things through the option menu, the family variable, the special string var variable, will be updated. And then in the option menu constructor, you specify the list of what you can specify is a series of values right here. It's a variable list, variable length list of values. But the way to do it when you've predefined a separate list is just to say star family list, the name of the list itself. And I think we'll leave it at that for now. Let's do family button.pack. This puts it into the root window. So let's see what we have at this point. All right. So there's our third widget here. This is the option menu button. So what happens when you have an option button, it's a drop-down menu. So as I click on it, I get the various options that I've specified, and then I can choose one, and it changes, and it shows you what that change is, shows you what the current value is in the button itself, and I can change it to whatever I want as often as I'd like. And once again, I'm interacting with the widget. The widget is perfectly fine, but it's not having any effect on, in particular, the label. Excuse me. Because I didn't set up that relationship. I need to now add an event handler, a function that's going to process the option menu when the option menu value is changed. So let's add that. Into the option menu constructor, I'll add again a command. I'll call this function family update. And now we need to go add that event handler function. Def family update. Now this one, just like the size update, takes one parameter, the value of the new value of the option button. So I'll call it new family. So what do we want to do? We want to, very similarly to updating the size, we want to update, in this case, the font family name. So once again, we'll do quote.configure, specify the font, and instead of hard coding Arial, I'm going to specify new family. Now, I could specify a size here. I don't want to specify a hard-coded value because we may have already updated the size using the slider that we set up. So what do we do here? Well, at this point, I will go ahead and get, remember the variable for the size slider was called size, and I'm going to get its current value. Instead of hard coding anything there for a particular one, I'm going to get the current value of that variable, of the size variable. All right. Let's see what that looks like. Same as usual. I'm going to change it to Courier. Change the font. The text stayed the same, but now it's showing it as Courier in 24 point. I can still change the size. Oh, look at that. The moment I started sliding the slider, the font changed back from Courier. It's not actually in Courier right now. It's back to Arial. So let's see about that. Aha. That's why when we called the size update event handler every time the slider moves, we're deliberately setting it back to Arial. Well, just like when we updated the family, we wanted to use the size as specified by the slider. Every time we update the size itself, we want to use the font as specified by the family variable. So I'm going to say, instead of hard coding Arial there, I'm going to say family.get. So these two kind of work in concert. I'll use whatever the size is and change the family, or I'm going to use whatever the family is and change the size. Let's see how that one works now. Again, it comes up in Arial, 24 point, and that's what it's showing. Let's change it to Courier. And now as I change the slider, it stays in Courier. Note that I can make this bigger to view the size if I need to. Okay, let's change it to Times New Roman. All right, but these are now cooperating. They're working in concert. They're taking both of these values as dynamically defined by the widget itself is being taken into account whenever either of those two characteristics gets changed for the label itself. Let's see if there's anything else I want to do with the font family before we move on. I think that'll do it. All right. Let's start doing some other things. Instead of just this one quote, let's give ourselves a few options for what the quote actually is, what the text of the quote actually is. And I'm going to use a widget called a radio button to specify that. Actually, a series of radio buttons, a set of radio buttons that work together. And I'm going to put that in between. I'm going to put that up here above the slider and after the quote itself, after the label itself. All right. We're going to also introduce with this one a kind of another level of the GUI itself, of the hierarchy of widgets, just in order to kind of group some things together and be able to control exactly what they look like. So to do that, I'm going to use something called a frame. So after I create the label and before I worry about the slider, I'm going to put something right in here. And I'm going to start by creating, well, let's do a couple of things. First of all, let's create a quote list, just like we had a font family list. I'm going to have a series of quote options I can use. And I'll put, I think, therefore, I am as my first option. But let's do a couple of other options as well. I'm going to put in measure twice, period, cut once. That's something a carpenter might say. And I'm going to have a third option. I am serious, and don't call me Shirley. Now, I've got a hyphen in this one, so I can't use the single quotes on this one. I'll use double quotes, and then everybody should be happy. So my quote list is 3 different quotes. I'll just leave it at 3. Again, I could have as many as I want. I think, therefore I am, measure twice, cut once. I am serious, and don't call me Shirley. By the way, where does this come from, this quote here? Anyone? Anyone? This would work better if it was live. I'll go ahead and answer it myself. That's from the movie Airplane. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and go see it right now. Pause this and go see it, and we'll pick up when you come back. Okay, glad you're back. All right, now that we have our quote list, let's do something with it. First of all, let's change what the label comes up in. Instead of, I could leave it hard-coded there, but let's change it so that it is specified using the list that we just set up. So I'll set it as quote list sub 0. So that initializes it to the same thing. And I just realized that if I'm going to do that, I need to have this above where I create the label so that it knows what that list is. All right, so we have that in, and initializing it from the list. Okay, so what are we going to do to specify which one of these I want showing? Initially it comes up as 1, but I want to be able to change it. So I'm going to create another variable. I'm going to call this one quote index, because I'm going to use the index values 0, 1, or 2 to specify which of the 3 quotes I want. And I am going to make that an int variable. And then before I go create my radio buttons, I'm going to create something called a frame to put them in. So quote frame equals capital F frame. And I'll put this one again initially in the root level. A frame is an area of your GUI, a container, if you will, that holds other widgets, but that way you can manipulate it at the frame level and move things around as a group and do padding and other visual effects for that as you go. So I'm going to make the quote frame be put right into the root window. I'm going to also specify for the background, I'm going to just deliberately make it green right now, just so that it stands out and you can see where the frame is compared to anything else. And then I'm going to say quote frame dot pack. But there's nothing in that frame yet, so let's create some things and put them in that frame, and then the frame is in the window, and everything will be visible. So I'm going to create a radio button, and I'm going to put it in the quote frame, right? Usually, or in the past, we've said root here, because we've put it directly in the window, but I'm going to put this button in the frame, and the frame has been put in the root window, to give us that kind of extra layer of control. I'm going to specify whatever text I want on the button. In this case, I will say philosophy. I will give it a value. I will specify the variable it corresponds to, quote index that I set up right here. and I need to specify a command that will be executed, the event handler, for whenever this radio button is chosen. And I will call that quote update. All right. A couple of things. Note that I didn't put this radio button, I didn't create a radio button and store it in a variable like I did, for instance, the slider. I created the scale and then I put it into a variable that I could then refer to later as I changed various things. I certainly could do that with my radio button, but we're going to have 3 of these, and it turns out that for what I'm trying to do, I don't need a separate variable, and I can do this instead. All I really care about is that it gets shown. So I can chain the creation of this radio button and just say .pack right after. So I create the radio button and pack it automatically, and that's all I really need is for him to show up in the frame, and therefore I'm good to go. If I ever needed to do other things to it, I could give it a separate variable name and refer to it like that. So what I'm going to do now is copy this and paste it twice more, because I want 3 of these. I want 3 different radio buttons, all labeled differently. The first one will be philosophy, that corresponds to the philosophic quote. The second one has to do with carpentry. And the third one is really comedy. So I have 3 radio buttons labeled philosophy, carpentry, and comedy. Their values should be different, and these values are going to correspond to the index of the quote in this list. So it should be what? The first one is value 0, second one is value 1, third one value is 2. Now, radio buttons work in concert. A group of radio buttons control one particular value. So the variable that's used for this whole set of radio buttons is the same. That's what makes them work together to provide what's referred to as mutual exclusion. Only one of the quotes can be chosen at a time. And if you choose another one, then the setting on the one that was chosen, excuse me, is automatically kind of unset, right? You're used to seeing radio buttons in other contexts, so that's what we're doing here. Let's see if there's anything else I need to do at the moment. There are some changes we will do in a bit, but let's see what this does. Oop. Something. It's not a capital B. It's radio button little b. So let's run that again. Quote, update is not defined. I gave it a, so the program blew up again. I gave it a event handler function, but then I didn't go up here and define it. So let's put that in. I'll put it above the others since the widgets are above the others. Quote update. And in this case, it doesn't take a particular parameter. We'll just use the get method to access whatever value we need. So quote dot configure. And this time it's not anything about the font that I'm changing. It's the actual text of the quote itself. So I'm just going to say text equals what? Quote list. And then which one from the quote list do I want? The quote index variable dot get. Right? The radio button will control which index is being specified. So I use that index to get a particular quote, particular text, set that for the label, and then that should change the name or change the string that's displayed every time. So that time we ran okay. That certainly doesn't look particularly good. But these are, there's the behind the scenes. You can kind of see the little green that's poking out here. These radio buttons are filling up the frame for the most part, but you still see a little bit here. These are also centered on top of each other instead of kind of lined up to the left as you might expect. But let's see if it actually works. The philosophical quote is showing initially. I'm going to hit the carpentry quote, and sure enough, the text of the label changed. Hit the comedy one, it changes to that. So it's a radio button, which means the moment you press 1, the one that was selected is immediately unselected, right? These guys are working together to provide a mutually exclusive single value, right? Only one type of quote is to be displayed at a time in our particular situation. So that's appropriate for the use of radio buttons. The reason they're called radio buttons comes kind of historically from the preset buttons that were in old-fashioned car radios, where literally you pushed a button in and it would pop out the other one that was currently pushed in, meaning only one of them could be in or on at any one time. All right, so let's do a couple of things to clean this up. Let's line these guys up on the left side so that they are a little bit more visually appealing. So down here where I created these, in the pack call, I'm going to set the anchor. We did this on a couple of things last time where we centered them. I'm going to set the anchor to W or west, and that's going to align their left edges. I'm going to do that on all three of them. Run it again, and this time at least they kind of line up on the side. All of the extra space where you see the green of the frame shining through. These three radio buttons have been packed into the frame, so the frame is no bigger than it has to be to hold these three buttons, and the buttons themselves with their labels take up almost all of the space, but you see the green peeking out from behind as part of the rest of the frame. All right. So I think, again, we can clean up the look and feel of this, which we'll do at the end. But at least we have working radio buttons that change the actual text, and we haven't changed anything about the font. So if I make this bigger and then go change, it still kind of takes into account the current settings of the font size and the font itself, the font type. I'll take it to Times New Roman and change it, and it stays in Times New Roman at, in this case, 45 point size, that kind of thing. All right. So still some cleanup to do in terms of the look and feel, but I think we've got that going. Let me see what we want to do next. I'm going to provide another series of buttons, except not radio buttons. I'm going to provide some check buttons, check boxes they're sometimes called, to be able to change the characteristics of the label, of the font, in terms of setting various things on and off, like being able to make it bold or italic or underlined. All of those are various characteristics, and in tkinter, they are controlled by various characteristics of the font. So we're going to add that characteristic, but instead of, just to deliberately make this a little more interesting, instead of just making it yet another set of buttons, either after, in between these two, or something else, I'm going to create a set of buttons that kind of reside next to the set of buttons that control what the quote is. I'm going to have a set of buttons next to it that control kind of exactly what that looks like in terms of bold and italic and whatnot. So to do that, I'm going to create yet another layer of control here. I'm going to put another frame. I'll have a frame to hold those new set of 3 buttons, but then I'm going to put both of those frames in another frame, right? So they can operate as a group, if you will. And I'll just call that outer frame controls. So let's start putting that piece of the puzzle together. Well, I tell you what, I'll do it separately for now, and then put it in the controls to kind of show you exactly what we're getting at there. Okay, so let's go down after the radio buttons, and I'm going to create some variables, some more variables. I'll say bold equals, this time I'm going to do a Boolean var, and I'm going to have 3 separate variables, because any of these 3 can occur at the same time. So I want them to be independent of each other. That's why we're going to use checkboxes as opposed to radio buttons. Any combination of these 3 will be acceptable. So I'm going to have 3 separate variables to control whether or not each one of them is in play. I'm going to call this, just in general, the style set of buttons. So style, let's set up this frame. Style frame equals a new frame. I'll put this in the root for now, and then we'll come back and add that other layer of control here. I'll set the background of this one to blue, again, just to distinguish it for now. Style frame dot pack, so that it shows up. And then I need to put some things into that style frame. So just like I have radio buttons in the quote frame, I'm going to have check button in the style frame. And again, I can specify the text of the button, bold. The variable I want to correspond to that will be the bold variable I just set up here, bold. I'm going to have one command, one event handler, to handle all of the changes to any of these style issues. So I'll call it style update, to be kind of consistent with how I've been doing things. I'm going to kick this down to the next line so these lines don't get too long. And then I'm going to do the dot pack the way we did the others. I'll go ahead and put in the anchor so they line up on the left side, just the way we did with the radio buttons. Let's see, do I have everything I want to in there? I think so. So I'm going to copy these 2 lines again and make 2 more, except I want one to be bold, one to control italic, and one to control whether or not it's underlined. But again, instead of working on the same variable, I'm going to store these values in 3 separate variables. The 3 I've set up right here. So bold, italic, and underline, all anchored on the west. and all using the same event handler called style update. Let's see. I think that's good there. So let's go add our style update function. And let me show you this. Instead of worrying about all the details of this right now, I'm going to put in the command pass. I'm not sure we've used that one before. It's a statement that you can use in Python to basically mean don't do anything. It's a statement as opposed to leaving it blank, which would cause a syntax error if I define the header of the file and header of the function and then put nothing in it. So this is now officially a function that does nothing. It just passes along the control. So I'm going to run this as is just to see what we have. All right, it's getting a little challenging to see all of the details because these are kind of smack up against each other. But we have our one frame that has a background of green with our 3 radio buttons that control what text is being shown. And now I have a separate frame with a background of blue controlling whether or not these are check buttons as opposed to radio buttons. So the style is a little bit different. This is more of a square as opposed to the circle. That can all be checked in any combination, right? Up here, I had radio buttons that if I checked one, the other one that was checked becomes unchecked. But down here, I can have any combination of these checked or unchecked. Because they all 3 could apply, right? I could have this one string presented in bold and italic and underlined all at the same time. Or maybe I want it just bold and underlined, or just underlined, or any combination I choose. Any of the combinations are valid, which is why I'm using checkboxes as opposed to radio buttons. All right. Now, checking these isn't accomplishing anything because the event handler just has a pass statement in. So let's go update the event handler so that it actually does the effect that we want. Then we'll come back and worry about kind of where these are in relation to. I'm going to move these 3, this whole frame, the blue frame, up next to the green frame so that it lays out a little bit nicer. But for right now, let's go actually make the buttons do something, make them work. So let's think. When I hit any of the check buttons, any of them, it's going to call the style update function. So up here in style update, this might be called when any of those buttons get hit. So let's see. Ultimately, I'm going to create I'm going to configure the quote again with a new font, right? Because it's the font that specifies things like bold. I told you the third parameter, the third value in the tuple can be a string that specifies things like bold and underline and whatnot. So I'm going to update the font, but it's going to stay in the same family. So I'll do a family.get for the family and the size.get for the size. But now I'm going to add this third value to the tuple, and that's going to be a string that includes the words like bold or italic and whatnot. So I need that. So I'm going to construct that string because it could be one of several possibilities. So I'm going to say style string is initially nothing. the empty string. And then I'm just going to add each piece if it's appropriate. So I'm going to say if bold.get, if the value of that bold special variable is turned on, right? This comes back as a Boolean yes or no. The checkbox is either checked or it is not. If get comes back as true, then I will add to the style string, or I will set the style string. This is my first one, so I'll set it to bold. And maybe that's the only one that gets set. Maybe that's the only one that is checked, in which case that would be the entire style string. And this is the string, by the way, I'm going to be passing in here. Style string. All right. But what about the other two? Well, if italic.get, then I want to set style string to have italic in it as well. But bold might already be set, might already be part of the string, so I'm going to tack it onto the string and put a space in front of it to add italic. So in case they're both checked, then the string would be bold space italic. Do the same thing for underline.get. Style string plus equal space underline. So let's think this through. Style update gets called when any of these buttons get pressed. If bold has been selected, has been checked, then we start off with a style string of bold. If italic has been checked, we add italic to the string. And if underline has been checked, we add underline to the string. So it could be all three, in which case the string would be bold space, italic space, underline. But it also could be any combination of the two. So let's say it's just italic. This would not be true. This would be true. So the string would just be space italic. The space in front doesn't hurt anything. This would not be true. So the only style that we specified in the style string would be italic. And again, any combination will work. All right, let's see where we stand at this point. I think we got everything in place for at least to be working. So without changing anything else, let's make this bold. Didn't change. Did change italic. Italic is changing. Underline is changing. But bold is not. Something not quite right here. Let's see what we... Oh, that's because I typed the wrong thing here. I said style instead of style string. That's my error. There we go. Now if I hit bold, there it is. Now it's bold. Now it's bold and italic. Now it's a bold, italic, and underlined. Oh, I didn't mean for that to be italic. Take that off. Now it's just bold and underlined. Every time any of these is checked or unchecked, this event handler is called. I get whatever's appropriate at the moment, and I change the font of the label accordingly so that any possible combination will work. And again, while those are true, oh, this is interesting. I've got it now as bold and italic, but watch what happens when I change the size now. Boom. I lost my bold and I lost my italic. It's still the philosophy quote, and now it's a 29, and it's still Arial, but I lost the bold and italic. If I hit underline now, all three of them kicked in. If I change the font, I lost my bold, italic, and underline again. Change one there, it kicks back in. So, why is that? When I interact with these other guys, like updating the size, for instance, with the slider, It changes the font to be the font family and the new size, but there is no style string, so it just comes up as normal. So once again, I need all of these guys to work together so that every time I affect one, I maintain the characteristics of the others. So what I want is when I update the size to specify a style string that corresponds to the status of those three checkboxes. So I guess I could copy these lines exactly and put them here. And then I'd have to do the same thing when I do the family update. That's starting to get redundant. And what if one of these changes? That's not a good approach. So what I'm going to do is, now that I need to do this logic multiple times, I'm going to pull this part of it out, the stuff I've highlighted here, into its own little function. I'll add another little helper function right at the top that I'll call get the style string. His role in life is to do nothing but decide what the style string should be given the current status of those buttons. So I'm going to cut these lines from this that we've got working, put it up here in this function, and his role in life is to create the style string based on these three and return it. So I need to add a new return line, return style string. Okay, so there's the logic that decides what the style string should be. And when I call, for instance, style update, instead of doing all that logic separately, I'm just going to simply say the style string is equal to get style string. It goes and gets the appropriate style string, and then I use it here. And now that I have that, I can do the exact same line. I'm just going to copy that line, and down here in the, let's say, the size update, I'm going to add that line up here to go get the, even though this guy's responsible for changing the size, I do want to keep the style the way it is, the bold and underline and whatnot. So I'll go get the current status of that style and use it as I'm changing the size. Same thing with the family. When I update the family, I'm going to update the new family, get the size from the slider, and now get the style string using this helper function. And so now whenever I change any of them, I'm taking into account the current style as specified by those buttons. Now, what about this guy? Quote update is actually changing the quote based on the radio buttons. And note that I'm not specifying the font. I'm not changing anything about the font when I change the actual text of the quote. So there's no need to take any of that into account. I don't have to take anything about fonts into account on the quote update event handler. All right, let's see what happens now. I got my radio buttons that can change what the actual quote is. I've got my check boxes that will do any combination of style issues. And now the thing we just fixed is that as I've got it bold and underlined right now, as I change the size of this, it stays bold and underlined because these three guys are consulted as I'm changing the size so that they're taken into account, the quote itself is taken into account, the font family is taken into account. Same thing here. If I change the font family to Times New Roman, and then, well, and when I did that change, I still kept the style issues of bold and underline. So I think these guys are now all working in concert, taking each other into account as changes are made. In fact, I think functionally we have everything squared away that we want to do here. Let's just clean up the look and feel of this a little bit, make this a little bit more of a presentable interface, and go from there. So first thing I'm going to do is create this other frame that I can put these two frames into, and I'm going to put them side by side. I think that'll lay things out a little bit better. So I will go down to under where we create the quotes. And I'm going to create another frame. I'll just call it controls equals a frame that'll go into the root controls.pack. Okay, so now I have another frame going in right under the label. And instead of the quote frame going straight into the root, let's put the quote frame into the controls frame and put the style frame, instead of going straight into the root, also into the controls frame. Let's add a configure call here, controls.configure, just so I can set the background of this guy. And again, I'm just going to pick a distinct color, something we haven't used yet. I'll put the background of the controls frame to yellow, just so we can see what's what. So that's what we have. I see the green behind the radio buttons. I see the blue behind the check boxes. I see a little edge of yellow here where the background of the whole thing is showing. Both of these frames, the green and the blue frames, are inside another frame that's working together. But let's move the blue frame up next to it. So how do I do it? Right now they're packed in and they go one on top of the other. So what do we do to make that side by side? And here's the easiest way to do it. By the way, there's a variety, there's always multiple options in terms of how you can control the look and feel. Let's do this one this way. I'm going to specify the side parameter on the quote frame, the green-backed frame, to be left. I'm going to do the same thing down here with the style frame. I'll set its side equal to left. The side by default puts them one on top of the other. By setting the side, I am putting them side by side. Again, I see the green radio button frame, the blue check button frame. Now at least they're side by side. I want to put some spacing in between the two, and then we'll start worrying about kind of the backgrounds of all of these so that they kind of blend in nicely to my GUI in general. What I want is this to look like a one cohesive unit, as opposed to the kind of all these separate pieces that I have right now. But let's start by putting some space in the in between the two, and I think the easiest way to do that will be to go to the quote frame, the first of the two, and I'm going to add padding here. This time I'm going to make padding X, again a tuple, and I'll have nothing on the left-hand side, but then 50, let's say, pixels to the right. All right, that's starting to spread it out. Now I can see a lot more yellow. So there's one frame, the yellow frame, that has the green frame in it and the blue frame in it, for lack of a better way to specify it. And now I can see a lot more of the yellow because I deliberately put some padding after or around this quotes frame. I put 0 padding on the left-hand side, and I put 50 pixels of padding on the right-hand side of that one, which is spacing these guys out. All right, so I think layout-wise, this is a little bit more reasonable. Obviously, color-wise, this is um, kind of a nightmare. So let's start to clean that up. And I think if we clean that up, we're going to be pretty much done here. What is the way? What are we going to start with? Note that all of these are kind of by default have a white background. That's the default unless you specified. So let's start with the label itself. What if I want these words? I don't want that white background. I want it to blend in with the light blue of the background of my window. So I'm going to go up to where I'm creating the actual label, and I'm going to call the configure function on that so that I can specify the background. Now let's see. I could put light blue knowing that my window has a light blue background. So let's see what that does. All right, sure enough, the white of that was behind the label is now light blue. So that kind of blends it in and makes it one piece. It's not so jarring. Here's the problem with this approach. If I'm going to put light blue as the background of all of these so they all blend in, what if I then change the background of I want to change the background of my window? I'd have to go find every place I did that. So let's do it a slightly more efficient way. The background of the label isn't going to be explicitly hard-coded as light blue. I'm going to say go to the root element and get whatever its background value is and use that. So the background is light blue. Go get the background of that root window. And so it still blends in nicely. But now, if I changed light blue to something else, then the background of the label would automatically be reflected. Let's see, what else should we change the background of? Let's go all the way down to the bottom here and change the background of the option menu button. Configure background equals, and let's do the exact same thing. Let's go get the background of the root and make that the background of my button. Run that. All right, so now, if you remember, that was had a kind of a white rectangular background, and now it's blended in with the blue and actually gave it a slightly tinted background for the drop-down itself. Okay, that kind of fits in a little bit nicely. Look at the slider here. Slider has white all where the label is of the value, etc. Let's see what happens when we change that. I'm going to actually copy this line because it's probably very similar. The size slider, dot configure background, root background. And there we go. Now the slider has blends in a little bit nicer. Okay. There are some things I can control with these. So one other thing, for instance, I could do with the slider is the color of what's referred to as the trough. That is to say, the area back here that's that the slider moves up and down in. So let's change that while I'm here, just for grins. It's called the variable. I mean, the parameter is called trough color. I'm going to set that to distinctly to blue, not the light blue of the background, but a contrasting blue, same blue as this. And now that kind of stands out. And, this is now starting to get into the realm of what do you prefer, what do you think looks good, etc. I'll leave it there for now, just as a nice, clear contrast. Let's go change this. Obviously, the yellow of the the blue of the frame, the green of the frame, and the yellow of the frame that's in both of those all could be changed to what? To this, essentially. I'm going to copy this guy. Do that for there, that for the green, and that for the blue. So now all of them will blend in nicely in terms of the frames. We still got the backgrounds of these guys, and so we will update those as well as our last step here. And I can do these right in the, instead of calling configure, which I would need a separate variable to do. Let's add all these right here at the end of the constructor. Background equals, again, root background color, background like so. And I'm going to copy that down to here and paste it here and here so that it's true for all three check buttons. Let's see what that looks like. Aha. All three blending in kind of nicely in one coherent three. Let's go do that. Same thing with the radio buttons. Paste, paste, and paste. Again, there are other ways this could be accomplished. And I think we might have it, folks. Let's think through here. We've got one of three options for the quote itself. Whichever quote is being shown, I can put it in any combination of styles. I can control the size of the quote, and I control the font family that it's displayed in. All of them are working nicely together in the sense that you change one and the others are still reflected. We had to work on that a little bit. And I'm using the appropriate widget for the right situation. In the case of which quote is being shown, that's appropriate to use radio buttons because they're mutually exclusive. I only want one possible value being selected at a time. Whereas these could all be happening at the same time, so these work independently of each other. Any combination is valid. I used a slider to determine the size because any value in this range we could call valid. And the slider makes it easy to select a particular value. And I was able to specify the minimum and the maximum as I saw fit. I certainly could have changed that to be a different range. And then again on the font family, I used a drop-down, what's referred to as an option menu widget. Now, let's think about that for a second. That's essentially the same kind of scenario as I have up here with my radio buttons. Right? I only want one of my possible choices to be reflected. So I could have done the font family as a series of 3 radio buttons, or I could have done the radio button option to choose which quote is displayed, I could have done that as a menu option, as a drop-down menu. Right? What's the difference? Here I want the options to be seen all the time. Here you don't see it until you press the drop-down. Sometimes it's 6 and 1.5 does the other. It doesn't matter which way you go. Sometimes maybe it does. Right? You make decisions. You make choices when you design your GUI so that it lays out nicely, so that the color schemes work, right? And so you're using the best widget for the job depending on what you're doing. All right, folks, I think we've got a nice working example here showing lots of different features, different widget types, lots of different event handlers. And I think we'll leave this example here for now, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.